folks, he was reelected to a full six-year term. Remember, 2020, there was a runoff. It was Raphael Warnock, John Ossoff. Both of them were in highly contested runoff elections in Georgia. You know, we dang near moved to Georgia for those 5 weeks to help them with that. Well, for Senator Ossoff, he had the full six-year term. Senator Warnock, he had to run again in 2022, but now he can go, all right, cool. I'm here for 6 years. After folks turned out in big numbers, he joins us right now. Frat, been waiting for you to get here, to come sit in the chair.
Good to see you, brother.
It ain't like you know, it ain't like it's a hot seat, you know. But sometimes it can get a little hot.
Look,
but,
I won 5 elections in 3 years, but who's counting? Here we are.
Yeah,
good to see you, man.
A whole lot of elections. Absolutely good to see you. A lot going on in D.C. Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, AOC, is going on.
Right.
We'll chat about that in a second. But it's been a crazy news day already. One of your colleagues indicted in New Jersey. Democrats in his state have been calling for him to resign. Your thoughts on this indictment of Robert Menendez, $480,000 in cash found in his home, and literally the feds say DNA of one of the folks involved who was bribing him found on envelopes. When you have a very narrow margin already in the United States Senate.
Well, listen, all of us who are elected to public office, for me, that represents a sacred trust and covenant between the person elected and the people who elected you. We'll see how all of this plays out. This is very fresh, and we'll witness a judicial process at work.
And I saw one story before that he has already given up a committee gavel, but some of the Democrats are saying, look, there's no way you can, because it's already been indicted before. It was a hung jury. They're saying, look, the feds, you know, put out literally the cash and the envelopes, things along those lines, on the Department of Justice website. And with already a very tenuous situation, a very small margin, you do not have a lot of room to work with there in the United States Senate with Democrats.
Well, one of the great things about our country, at least we extol, is that no one is above the law, no one is below the law. And I will wait and see how this plays out.
Another issue, President Joe Biden has been going back and forth over this UAW strike. The UAW folks announced that they're going to be expanding their strike across the country. Go to my iPad. President Biden apparently is going to be joining the picket lines for the United Auto Workers. Your thoughts about that?
Well, listen, I'm a big champion of workers. And, you know, I watched my dad. He wasn't a member of a union, but I watched him work hard with his hands. He was a small business owner. I don't think most people mind working hard. They just want to share in the prosperity that they're helping to create for others. And so the strength of collective bargaining is an important tradition in our country. We're seeing it play out. And by the way, I don't buy this political divide you see often between being pro-worker and pro-business. I want to see businesses thrive so that families can thrive. But it's important for workers to have that kind of collective strength so that they can negotiate. And when that's not there, we see this increasing wealth divide, and people are not able to thrive. And so we'll see how this plays out.
One of your colleagues, Senator Tim Scott, made a statement that if people go on strike, they should be fired. President Joe Biden's team did not wait long to turn a lot of these Republican comments into an ad. We'd love to play this, get your thoughts on it. Go to my iPad, Anthony.
When you have a president that's constantly saying, go union, this is what you get. The unions get emboldened, and then they start asking for things.
The first bill he passed had $86 billion for union pensions.
This president clearly does prioritize union jobs, and he's made very clear here that union workers deserve more, that their pay increases have not come close to the success and the money that all of these auto companies have enjoyed.
The thing that's interesting is we're seeing numbers. Union support is at almost an all-time high. The last 6-7 years has been stunning, even to folks in unions, with how the American people have responded, because for the longest it was unions are awful, let's be right to work, and so many folks are now saying, wait a minute, you know what, collective bargaining ain't a bad idea.
Look, Americans across the political spectrum, I think, have witnessed over the last few decades this growing divide between the compensation of the average worker and their CEOs. And these are the issues that are being raised. This is just one example. But, you know, when I hear one of my colleagues talk about who ought to be fired and people doing their job, I'd love to see my colleagues over in the House do their job. I'd love to see Congress do its job and keep the government open. Because certainly that's not helping working families in Georgia. The people I'm talking to are thinking about the high costs of prescription drugs, the costs of health care in general. They are concerned and trying to keep their families safe. We've had more mass shootings this year than we've had days this year. I just did a panel discussion over at the Congressional Black Caucus weekend this week. It featured Quavo, who's undergone his own tragedy in recent months. My colleague, Lucy McBath, who lost her son, transformed her pain into power, got involved in politics. We're witnessing all of this American carnage, and Congress hasn't done nearly enough. And so I'd like to see us, you know, get something done on gun safety, on prescription drugs, on creating jobs and opportunity for average Americans.
And to that point, I mean, we see the energy. We saw the energy in Tennessee when the Republicans booted out two out of three, both African Americans. Gloria Johnson wasn't booted out, and they were responding to the people who were demanding change after there was a shooting at this Christian school. Then the Republicans there then began to literally throw people out who were holding up signs. And so they spent more time attacking the folk who were crying about their children being killed than to deal with the issue of guns.
It's awful. You know, what we witnessed in Tennessee, we've seen time and time again, another tragic flashpoint. And for folks who are trying, you know, this happens so often, I'm not sure people even remember what happened. But a killing at a Christian school involving the youngest of children and others, and you had a movement emerge, people responding to that. And rather than using their power to do something about safety, we saw this anti-democratic effort afoot in the Tennessee legislature. They threw these young legislators out. One of them visited my church in recent months, and I was certainly inspired by their leadership, by their voice. But we are seeing, Roland, this kind of assault, this unabashed, unembarrassed assault on our democracy from people who know that they're losing the argument. They're losing the argument on gun safety. They're losing the argument on reproductive choice. They're losing the argument on a whole range of issues. And so rather than have the people pick their representatives, the representatives are trying to pick their voters or throw out the representatives that the voters have selected. You won't hear me say this much, especially on Roland Martin Unfiltered, but a Fox News poll said that 87% of Americans believe that we ought to have universal background checks. We ought to at least know who's owning the guns, and yet no real discussion, something I was pushing my colleagues on in recent weeks and in recent months. No real conversation about that. As divided as the country is, I don't think the people are as divided as is reflected in the politics. And that's a democracy problem. And the Congressional Black Caucus, whose weekend I chair this year, has always been at the center of that conversation. We've got to do something about all these issues, but I think job one is fighting for the democracy itself. And I do think that Black people, given our history, given our struggle, just to have our humanity acknowledged, to have our voices heard, have always had a special role to play in that. And I'm proud to be a part of a movement that centers racial equity, but is multiracial in its expanse and is focused on giving the people their voice back in their own democracy.
We talked about the CDCF. I moderated a panel today with Congressman Hank Johnson about expanding the courts. And what he argued is that, first of all, we've expanded the courts before. They did not begin at 9. The country has changed. We look at the circuit courts that changed as well. Do you believe there should be an expansion of the Supreme Court when we look at a lot of these critical issues first? And then got to get your thoughts on should there be ethics reform? There's a new story from ProPublica about Clarence Thomas literally participating in Coke Network fundraisers. Republican judges are saying that absolutely crosses the line. A Supreme Court justice should not be attending fundraisers for right-wing conservative groups.
Well, sadly, the Republican leader certainly believes in expanding the courts. He's perhaps the only living senator who's actually done it. But certainly there ought to be ethics and accountability in the courts. I mean, this is a foundation of what it means to live in a democracy. We are watching what's happening in the Supreme Court. Clearly, it seems to me there is not a willingness to hold themselves accountable. So we've got to do something, I think, at the congressional level to push ethics reform. Whether you are elected to office or you're serving on the court, people have to know. I mean, this is how the democracy works. People have to know that decisions are being made and that it's not one's own self-interest that's guiding those decisions.
Like private plane rides and yacht rides and your wife getting several $100,000 from these conservative groups.
The influence of dark money, I think we are witnessing, whether we're talking about Supreme Court justices who seem to be enjoying themselves in ways that are quite interesting if you talk to the average American. Or you're talking about the outsized influence of dark money influencing something like the debate around gun safety. Again, there's movement on this issue in the public.
Right.
And I think what your viewers and others ought to be asking is, if there's movement in the public on this issue, even among Democrats and Republicans, why isn't there movement in the highest levels of our government? And that's because of the outsized impact of dark money in our politics, because of racial and partisan gerrymandering, people who are in districts and the only thing they're worried about is being challenged by somebody more extreme than them. All of these kind of anti-democratic efforts afoot in our democracy are the reason why we've got to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, which I introduced a few months ago. And also later this year, I'll introduce the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
I'm gonna come back to that. You mentioned the CBC a little bit earlier in terms of what their focus is. One of the areas they have really been focused on is on your side of the aisle, and that is they have been challenging Senator Dick Durbin to say, dude, the blue slips. You got federal judges, you got U.S. attorneys and others that are being held up by Republicans. They want him to end that practice. Have you had conversations with him about the blue slip and the concerns of CBC members in the House? Because literally, black folks, bottom line is, he's not chair of the committee unless black folks and others put you in office to secure that majority. And there are black people who are voting in all these other places around the country, and people aren't getting appointed because Republicans are holding them up, now going on 3 years.
Well, this is not a new controversy. We've heard it before. And depending on who's in office and who has the majority, it plays a couple of different ways. And it's something that I'm interested in as a member of the Senate. Obviously, I vote to confirm all of these folks if they're brought up for a vote. That blue slip has been used. I just want us to recognize in a few different ways.
And it's a relic from the Jim Crow era.
Well, there are a host of things that are a relic from that era.
There are people watching, and I deal with this every single day. And you talked earlier about the things that have been accomplished and how the American public is moving. But you have a significant number of African Americans who believe not enough is being done. Folks are talking about potentially sitting the election out, having protest vote, and that could very well impact whether Biden-Harris is reelected. What do you say to those people who are frustrated? George Floyd Justice Act wasn't passed. I've broken down that Senator Tim Scott and Senator Lindsey Graham didn't come through with that. You talked about John Lewis Act and others that President Biden has not delivered and what he said to African Americans, what would you say to those people who are angry and upset?
Well, first of all, in a very real sense, there is no such thing as sitting out a vote. To not vote is to vote.
But the last four cycles, the black vote has gone down.
That has implications. And look, I wish that this were just another ordinary election, as consequential as that would be. But I think this is an election to save the democracy itself. And we have fights about a whole range of things. Change has been slow and hard in this country. Black folk know that better than anybody. It comes in fits and starts. But the democracy is the framework in which we get to fight. And we are clearly in a fight at a fundamental level between those who believe in democracy and those who don't. That's the choice in this election. And
but you tell the White House they have to make a better argument, because Terrence Whitberry has his data. When he actually tells people go, nothing's been done, they're frustrated. But then when he literally explains, they go, it literally changes the data. So it seems as if those who have actually passed things might want to do a better job explaining what they've done.
That's what a campaign is all about. And I think that story will be told over the next few months. Look, President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris have been most effective. Here they were elected in the midst of a pandemic, unlike anything we've seen in our lifetimes, with a 50-50 Senate, thanks to what we did in Georgia, gave us the slightest of majorities we could have had. And with that slightest of majorities possible, we were able to pass the American Rescue Plan, which strengthened businesses, which kept our municipal governments flowing and operating, and had a provision, which is one of my favorite. It expanded the child tax credit, which would cut child poverty 40 to 50%. I'd like to see us extend that expanded child tax credit. We passed the first bipartisan.
I want to talk to Senator Joe Manchin about that.
We passed we passed the first bipartisan infrastructure bill after folks talking about infrastructure week and talking about infrastructure for a generation. We finally got something done on that front. We passed the CHIPS and Science bill. We passed the first, the largest veterans benefits program in a generation. And then we went back and passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which invests in American manufacturing, clean energy, and it contains my bill, which capped the cost of insulin for folks on Medicare to no more than $35 of out-of-pocket costs per month. I'm running into people all over Georgia all the time who say that literally changed their lives, and I'm hopeful that sometime between now and the end of the year, we will move another prescription drug bill through the Congress, which will include my provision, my bill, which would cap the cost of insulin for everybody, people with insurance, people who don't. I can tell you that matters in a state like Georgia, where we have 1 million diabetics. 12% of the adults have diabetes. That this has been an effective administration, and yet there's more work to do.
Last question. I think it's an easy one. So what do you tell those folks who say Biden just too old? He should not run again. He's too old.
Well, listen, that's part of the conversation. But I would say point to look at how effective he's been. Look what he's got done, and look at the alternative. I'm proud to stand alongside this president and this vice president, and I look forward to working with them over the next few years.
All right. Well, Senator, glad to have you. Look forward to having you back again here in the blackest newsroom in the country.
Good to be with you, my alpha brother.
Oh, yeah. You ain't going to find as much black art in any other news show. Never not at CNN, MSNBC.
It looks great. You all should see what I'm seeing. Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
All right,
Thanks
Roland.
a bunch.
Take care, man.
All right.